Thank you for joining us for Overtime, LIASB, Online Business Development, Cybersecurity, Common Sense Business Practices. Our guest, Daniel Martin, partner at Morrison Mahoney, LLP. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Daniel, before we get started, I want to go to a quote on cybersecurity, and it's from Robert Mueller, FBI director, back in 2012. And he said there were only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. And what I find when I talk to business owners, they don't seem to be overly concerned about being hacked. And I'm wondering if you see that same trend, or has that vision changed based on what's been happening recently around the world?
Well, I have seen that trend over the past several years, although I think in recent times, many businesses are starting to realize the risks they can face from hackers and cyber attacks, in particular with the most recent ransomware WannaCry attack that circulated around the world. I think through the publicity, a lot of businesses are starting to take these cyber risks very seriously.
Well, that's a good thing, because I believe that it is very important, especially for small businesses, to take cybersecurity very seriously. So that leads us into some typical questions that a lot of business owners have in regards to, just addressing or looking at cybersecurity. So let's just take a look at it. Why would hackers target a small business? And I want to highlight something that I saw recently where it said 82% of small business owners basically feel they are not the targets of an attack because they don't feel they have anything worth stealing.
That's a common misconception, and it's that type of thinking that leads to lax security practices and ultimately to the demise of a lot of businesses. Many small businesses maintain personal information of their employees or of their customers. Virtually any small business that sells a product or a service deals in credit card information or payment card information. And that's the low-hanging fruit for hackers. And hackers don't care if they get a credit card information, if they get credit card information from a Fortune 500 company or from a small mom-and-pop shop. That information is worth the same on the dark web or the black market, regardless of where it comes from. So it's definitely a common misconception that small businesses have, that they have nothing of value, because they do.
So for a hacker, you really can decide to do one of two things. Either spend a lot of time going through all of the security protocols and everything else of a big company to try to get a big payroll, or go to that low-hanging fruit, which is the small businesses, which may not be paying attention to all of those little details and making it easier for the hackers to get in.
That is true. I think one thing on the side of small businesses in that respect is that only major cyber attacks are actually targeted, and the majority of cyber criminals are indiscriminate. They'll target computer systems in both small and large companies indiscriminately. But you're right, to the extent that attacks are targeted, cyber criminals definitely will look to those smaller businesses or those businesses that they feel don't have sufficient resources to protect themselves. And to a large extent, it is the smaller businesses that don't have those resources or that security structure that a larger organization might.
Okay. And that leads into the second question. So what type of cyber attacks are there and that a small business should be concerned about?
Well, I think we have to start the conversation with phishing attacks. Because over 90% of cyber attacks start with a phishing email. And a phishing email is essentially a legitimate looking email from what appears to be a trustworthy source, such as a bank, a store, or even the government, And the goal of those emails are to get a user to click on a malicious link or to enter sensitive information or to download a virus. Now, phishing emails have kind of evolved from the early days into what we've seen recently of an attack known as a business compromise fraud, which is a business compromise fraud is a phishing email where cyber criminals will design and send a spoof company email or use social engineering to assume the identity of a CEO or of a company attorney or trusted vendor and use that email to infiltrate a system and get an employee to either send a wire transfer or to send confidential or sensitive business information. Now, these hackers are very good, and what they'll do is many times they'll infiltrate a computer system for maybe weeks or months at a time, and they'll learn how the employees speak to one another or how vendors ask for wire transfers and payments. And then they'll be able to use the information they've generated to send what appears to be a valid and very well-looking email to an employee requesting payment. And these types of things are very hard to detect, in particular when you have an email coming using the same language and employees speak, so to speak, that is being used throughout the company. One thing I'll also mention is ransomware. And as I mentioned at the outset, the WannaCry ransomware was something that spread across the globe a few weeks ago and really brought ransomware onto the radar of a lot of small businesses who hadn't been looking at these things. Ransomware is a piece of software that criminals use to lock a user out of a computer system by encrypting files and holding them for ransom, hence the name ransomware, for a specific dollar amount. And if you don't pay, the documents will either disappear or simply stay locked up and be unusable. And ransomware usually requires the user to pay in Bitcoin or another anonymous currency. We've also seen requests for payments in store or other types of debit cards or payment cards. But it's something anonymous that can't be tracked. And until the payment is made, the computers can't be used. And users that suffer from ransomware attack and don't have a backup of their system really are faced with no good options. They could either delete their entire system and reinstall everything, or they could try to decrypt the files, which is also not a very good option because they either have to bring in an outside vendor to do that, or they can try to buy some sort of third-party antivirus system. But that's not generally a good option because the ransomware makers know that, and they could update the malware and try to beat the software. The final option is to pay the ransom. But that's something that most people in the industry don't recommend because even if the ransom is paid, there is no guarantee that the decryption code will be provided. There's also no guarantee that the ransomware makers haven't left something behind on the system. Finally, I also just want to quickly mention social engineering, which is a threat that we've also seen a growing increase in a trend upward lately, because we've learned time and again that it's people and not technology that are the easiest and most commonly exploited cyber vulnerabilities. And social engineering is simply the art of manipulating people so that they give up confidential information such as passwords or bank information, or allow access to a computer system so that hackers can install malicious code. These types of tactics work generally because it's easier to exploit a person's natural inclination to trust than it is to discover ways to hack a software. And I'll just give a quick example where a small business may receive a phone call from someone pretending to be a vendor and seeking to extract password or other type of personal information, or the hackers pretending, for example, to be a company employee and maybe contacting IT and saying that they can't access a particular website. And of course, the IT rep is going to want to help and ask what the website is, and they'll be given a website and they'll click through. And once they do that, the code has been, or the virus has been downloaded. So those are some of the basic risks that face in terms of the threats that are out there.
Our next question is, what risk and costs do small businesses face as a result of a cyber attack? And before you answer, I found this question on the internet, and I thought the reply to this question was very interesting. It said that a threat is from an attacker that will use a vulnerability that was not mitigated because someone forgot to identify it as a risk. And I think that kind of sums up a lot in regards to why a business should look at multiple things when considering cybersecurity.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, it's important to understand that no small business, or really any business, can ever be totally safe. But most online attacks can be prevented and detected with basic security practices for both the IT systems and employees. And, there's an expression that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of pain. But in the cybersecurity world, it's really 100 pounds of pain, because there are just so many risks that can befall a business if they don't make cybersecurity part of their overall risk management protocol and to protect the most critical aspects. And just to get to your question, some of the risks are, first and foremost is reputational damage and loss of customers, loss of goodwill, and diminishment in brand loyalty. I mean, a company's reputation is essentially its most valuable asset. And if a company suffers a breach and suffers bad publicity from that, the loss of customer goodwill, it could be very hard to calculate, and it could be very significant for a company. Other more hard costs could be compliance with breach notification statutes. 48 states require customer notification in case personal information is taken from a company. And just sending out those notification letters and the postage will be very expensive. Of course, there are crisis management consultants that may need to be brought in, remediation expenses, credit and fraud monitoring may have to be provided pursuant to certain statute. There are legal fees for compliance litigation costs. When companies are breached, they usually get sued, and the litigation costs could stretch out for years. Of course, there's business interruption losses. If a company is shut down, even for a day or a week or a month, just think about how that can affect a small business. There could be forensic investigation expenses or restoration of network operations, and these costs stack on one another. And there's a very alarming statistic that 60% of small businesses that suffer breaches are out of business within 6 months. And it's because of the stacking of these costs. It's simply too much to withstand, which is why we stress the prevention. Again, an ounce of prevention worth 100 pounds of pain. It's because of this. Think about how just having a day of employee training, or even a memo to employees saying don't click on a link that may be malicious. That 1 second click could cause a company to shut down and ultimately go out of business, which is why we time and again stress employee training. The employee is the weak link in the chain, always, in any company. And to ensure that weak link is solidified as much as possible, those employees must be trained and made to be aware of the threats that are out there and the ways to prevent those threats from entering the system.
Mm-hmm. Kind of getting back to what you were saying in regards to social engineering, making sure that everybody within the organization is on the same page and doing what is necessary. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but what can be done by a small business to mitigate some of these risks associated with cyber attacks?
Well, as I mentioned, and I will beat the dead horse again, because the most important aspect of any good cybersecurity program is good employee training and education. The only way to ensure perfect cybersecurity is to get rid of all humans. Since that's not an option, usually, plan B is to train them. Train them how to spot phishing emails. Train them on how to protect data. Train them on the threats that are out there. There should be a bottoms-up effort to train all personnel and instill a culture of security in the organization or small business. And the training should be ongoing. It should be every 6 months or a year, and it should keep up with the evolving threat environment. In addition to training, I'll note that all businesses should have a written information security plan. And it sounds like a daunting thing, but it's really not. And it can be tailored for any company. It may be a page long, it may be 20 pages long. And what this plan will do is identify the information that the businesses store and what the value of the information is. It will identify the threats and vulnerabilities, and it will also identify if the business limits access to databases and which contain personal information to just those employees with the business needs. So it will kind of handle that the personnel aspects of the company's cybersecurity structure, but it should also handle the technical aspects of the cybersecurity structure, making sure that there are protocols in place for patching up operating systems, patching applications, installing firewalls on networks, securing wireless access points and networks, making sure that old media is disposed of properly and securely, and making sure that full backups are made of all important business data and information. And these are basic things that any small business can do to ensure that it's keeping up with the times and that it has a good cybersecurity program in place. So the program should be written, it should be updated, and it should be followed.
All right. It also, I mean, just based on the various topics you discussed just now, because we talked about people, we talked about systems. There's a lot that goes into this. Should a small business owner do this by themselves, or should they seek out advice from others who may be, let's say, experts in that field to do those assessments for them?
Well, I think for a small business without the, and there's different sizes of small businesses. If it's a very small business, they're most likely not going to have resources to do this on their own, and they should definitely seek out the advice of counsel. For bigger businesses that may have in-house counsel, that counsel, either on their own or in consultation with outside counsel, may be able to come up with a plan on their own. I will say there are outside vendors that can do penetration testing and kind of handling the technical components of making sure that a system is secure. Most small businesses will not have the resources in their IT department to do that, and they should definitely seek out the advice of an outside vendor who can come in and do that for them and with them undertake a risk assessment.
Okay. That leads into the next question. What should a business do if it's attacked?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. And, when I get asked that question, I always say if a business gets attacked, it should implement its written security response plan. And people say, well, what if they don't have a plan? I'll say, well, that's not a good answer. What you should do is have a plan and be able to immediately implement it. Every company should have a plan and have a team. And the team should consist of individuals both inside and outside the business who possess different skill sets. It may include IT people. It may include forensics people, human resources people. It may be PR, of course, legal departments, both outside and inside, and the security vendors that I just mentioned. The composition of the team will depend on the type of and size of the organization, but the most important thing is having that plan and knowing in advance what you're going to do. Even if it's one sheet of paper with the telephone numbers of the strike team, so to speak, the people that you'll need to call within the first half hour or an hour to make sure you get the wheels in motion. Have that plan, have that piece of paper, and of course keep it offline and make sure it's, you don't want to suffer ransomware and have your system locked out and have your plan to respond to it on that system. So keep it someplace where it's printed, where it's offline, and when it's available. And obviously, if you suffer a breach, and all this should be within the plan, you're going to want to contain it. You want to convene the breach response team. You want to evaluate and understand the cause of the incident. You want to identify who the person affected are, the affected persons, and what personal information may have been compromised. Then you want to have those phone numbers ready. You want to be able to reach out and contact the third-party information consultants that you know to assist in capturing relevant information and performing that forensic analysis. I also want to mention the first call should usually, I would always suggest, be to counsel. So counsel can direct the response to the breach and could control the flow of information. Usually in a breach, there'll be fallout in terms of, not usually, but there could be litigation that arises or regulatory inquiries, and certain legal protections could attach to documents as they're created during the course of the breach response. So a good lawyer or a good outside counsel will be able to manage the flow of the response to afford the business as much protection as possible as the breach response is being undertaken. And I'll just also add that the outside counsel will be able to analyze the legal implications of the breach and facilitate the contact of law enforcement if needed. Could help contact the insurance carrier if cyber insurance is implicated, and could also help identify the legal jurisdictions that are involved and the breach statutes which have been triggered, the notification statutes that have been triggered.
Mm-hmm. It kind of reminds me, we recently did something on compliance, and one of the things there that they were saying, once that investigation gets started, they also look at your documentation processes and how you did what you're supposed to do. So I believe that plan that you were talking about becomes very important. And one other thing hit me is that security plan should probably be in the employee handbook. The first day you hire somebody and you give them that employee handbook, that's one of the first things they should know.
Absolutely. And you raise a good point, because when a regulator or even during litigation looks at a company to see if they did what they were supposed to do, we're looking at a reasonableness standard. Did the company do what was reasonable under the circumstances? And when you look at a standard like that legally, what may be reasonable for a company for a billion-dollar company with a very robust IT infrastructure is not going to be the same what's reasonable for a 5-person company. Those companies will not be held to the same standard. But it is important to know that there still will be a reasonableness standard for the 5-person company. So it's important to make sure that even a small company does what is reasonable for a company for that size and that industry, and with the amount of resources that would be expected of a company given its size.
Our next question: cyber insurance necessary?
I think cyber insurance is necessary for most organizations. I think it's a very good risk mitigation tool. Cyber insurance could cover a lot of different things, and many companies or businesses, small businesses, can pick and choose the coverages that they feel necessary. Cyber insurance can cover such things as crisis management expenses, regulatory defense and penalties, business interruption expenses, and cyber extortion. Those are just a few things that cyber insurance can cover, but I would caution small businesses to make sure they review policies carefully, either with a broker or their counsel. And a few things I would urge them to look out for are to, number one, carefully examine limits of liability, because many cyber policies impose sublimits on some coverages. So a company may think that they have for example, $1 million cyber insurance policy and that's their coverage, but there may be a $25,000 or $50,000 sublimit for, say, business interruption. And that company may have a breach and may suffer $200,000 of business interruption and will not have sufficient coverage. So it's important to carefully examine the limits of liability. Also, I'll also urge companies to make sure that they obtain retroactive coverage, because cyber policies may limit coverage to breaches that occur after a specified date. So if you have a small business and you enter into a cyber policy that has coverage as of today, well, you may have had, or a company may have had, a virus living in their system for 6 months. And under that circumstances, even though the insured didn't know about that virus or that infiltration until a week from now, which is after the date they entered into the coverage, there'll be an exclusion for that coverage because the breach actually occurred 6 months ago. So it's very important to be aware of that. And I'll also caution any small business looking for coverage to be aware of exclusions. For example, some policies may exclude coverage for liability arising from a breach of contract, and many insureds collect and store confidential information from customers or business partners pursuant to a contract that require them to maintain that information. And if there's an exclusion for a breach resulting from a breach of contract, any damages arising from a breach of that information will be excluded under those contracts. So that's something that's very important to look out for.
Okay. All right. A lot of information, and it sounds like we could probably just have another session on the types of cyber security insurance and all of those pre-existing conditions and things of that nature that a business owner needs to concern themselves with when talking to their insurance carrier about cyber insurance.
Absolutely. And sorry to interrupt. The cyber insurance is a growing and evolving market, and there are a lot of nuances that continue to come out of these policies, and it definitely does lend itself to a more in-depth discussion.
Our last question for tonight is, are there any special considerations for providing information to third-party vendors or securing services in the cloud as it relates to cyber security?
Oh, absolutely, and it's something we kind of touched on in the insurance realm. But one thing I caution companies is that no matter how robust and buttoned up their cybersecurity program is, and no matter how much employee training they do and penetration testing, it could still leave itself exposed if it entrusts its information or its confidential information to third-party vendors who don't have similar cybersecurity structures in place. So it's very important for a company to oversee its service providers and to take reasonable steps, and again, we're coming to this reasonable standard, to make sure that it's selecting and retaining service providers that are capable of maintaining appropriate safeguards for customer information. And it'd be well within the rights of any company to request that a third-party vendor provide them with the details of its cybersecurity program. And of course, they can also require third-party vendors to or to ensure by contract that they implement and maintain safeguards. And that's the best way any company could protect itself, by getting that indemnification in place from the third-party vendor by contract.
Okay. So it's not just your own physical environment. Basically, anybody that you touch and touches you as well, the fact that they're connecting to your systems, they could possibly be a point of a breach.
That's right, and you raised a good point, because one of the most well-known was the Target breach of a few years ago, and I think they're up to $260 million in damages arising from that breach, so some staggering number. And that breach occurred through their HVAC vendor. Target needed some HVAC services and gave their vendor access to their entire system, and the HVAC vendor was breached. And that caused fallout, which we're still seeing today.
Amazing. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you for being on our show and providing a wealth of information for our audience. And if anybody has any follow-up questions, I'm sure Daniel wouldn't mind if you reached out to him, and his contact information is on the screen. But before we go, I want to just bring up a couple of questions that came up from our audience. I have one here that says, how do you prevent a man-in-the-middle attack? And I think we kind of touched on it, but could you clarify that for the audience?
We did. A man-in-the-middle attack is a very, I guess, a broad term for any time a hacker or a criminal kind of gets in between the information from where it's intending to go and where it should be going and where it does go. So, for example, we touched on the phishing scams and the business compromise email where spoof emails are sent. And again, the biggest way to prevent these types of attacks are the employee training and the education. And I'll also again reiterate the planning or the prevention and the planning and having written policies in place so that when a attack does happen, you can respond.
Mm-hmm. All right, excellent. Another question is, what's more secure, SSL or HTTPS?
Well, you know, I think there's probably some debate on that. And for questions like that, I usually say, you know what, that's probably a little bit out of my wheelhouse, and I'll defer to the technology professionals who are sitting behind and, you know, dealing with the hackers all day and trying to counter the threats. So I'm going to punt on that one for now, so I don't give information out of my wheelhouse.
We'll address that, and we'll reach out and get an answer for that attendance.
Yes, I mean, I definitely have resources I could tap into relatively easily with a phone call and find out, and I will do that.
Okay. All right. Well, Daniel, again, I want to thank you for being part of the show, and I look forward to having you back in the future. All right.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's show. Adelphi University, TBC, The Business Corners, Sorrento Calamas CPAs, and BBA Photography Corporation. Again, I want to thank our audience for participating in tonight's program, Overtime, LIASB's online business development series. See you next time. Have a good night.